Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out in the snow. It is really appreciated. Can I introduce myself? My name is Valerie Piet, and I'm the director of the International Observatory of Human Rights. And we've come here tonight for a very special event, which is all about community and the benefit of community sponsorship for refugees. I'm really excited. We have a fantastic panel, and I just appreciate you being here. And if I could just ask two things, if you could put off your cell phones, because we're filming this evening. And in true air hostess fashion, we have exits here and here in the event of a fire. That'd be fantastic. So, here we are. Benefits of community sponsorship. I wanted to tell you a little bit about IOHR to start off with. We're a relatively new-based NGO. We're here in London. And we came together with a group of journalists, researchers, social media practitioners, and human rights experts. And the reason that we did that was really to put human rights back on the radar. We came to the conclusion that in this world of terrorist threats and fake news and 30-second hashtags, that it's time to really put focus back into human rights and do what we do best, which is to tell a story. So what we've done is we've launched IOHR Web TV, and we wanted to create in-depth TV programs which really got underneath the rhetoric and let us tell some stories. And we also do primary research. So what we've done is we've looked at how events happen and what's underneath them. And we've started to develop in-depth piece of research. And so to give you an example, one of the pieces that we've just been working on is looking at Turkey and looking at the 150 journalists that currently are incarcerated in Turkish prisons. So my team did the research. We spoke to the families and the people on the ground in Turkey. We brought in a son of one of the journalists to really hear what the conditions were that his father was in. And then he invited us to Paris 2 weeks ago, and we were hosted by the Sorbonne Human Rights Association. And we put on an event there, and we brought together families from Turkey so they could talk about what was going on in their individual cases. And we put them together with two observers from Trial Reporters, Reporters Without Borders, and the head of human rights from the Federation of Journalists. And we heard firsthand what was going on. And this is what IOHR is trying to do. It's to bring research, the people together, put on events, and then do something about it. So we then took the same son, his son is the journalist Murakami Sabonko. I don't know if you guys are following the cases, but he's facing life imprisonment. And so we took him to the UN High Commissioner's office, and we briefed them in Geneva, and we told them what's going on the ground. And to be able to do that, to come from a position of knowledge and strength, is really exciting for a young NGO to be able to do. So our work is about achieving outcomes, and that's one of the things that tonight is all about. And we're following the same pattern. So Bettina, that you've met this evening, has done an amazing piece of research, both in Canada and here, looking at best practice in community sponsorship. We've interviewed local practitioners, Syrian families both here and in Canada. And we've interviewed on IOH TV tonight our very own Bekele Yho Beckley, who's done a fantastic job. And he's been describing his work in the UK with Sponsorship Refugee Foundation under the Citizens UK banner. So we're delighted to have you here tonight, Bekele. And we're recording tonight's event because we want to put it onto IOHR TV and share the stories that you're going to hear. We are just recording the people on stage. There's no need to worry. It's about the guys that are going to be here tonight. And it's all about putting it out on social media as well, because this is a really important story. And what we're trying to do is understand how we can work and how we can take what's best from Canada and what's best from the UK and really drive an agenda which is not just about getting people out of the sea and out of boats. It's about getting them settled in a community, getting them jobs in business, getting them educated, and giving Syrian refugees a new life. It's also appropriate that we're here on World NGO Day, which is a day to celebrate, commemorate, and collaborate, according to their website. So the celebrate is that we have a guest tonight who's living proof that community sponsorship can be a huge success. And I'm very delighted to be joined by Mohammad Al Saleh, who's just come off the plane from Canada. So thank you so much for doing that. It is fantastic you were able to make it, especially through the snow. And he's a Syrian refugee, and he settled in Canada in 2014, and he now helps new refugees to be settled, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your story in a moment. The commemorate comes from our other Canadian guest, Michelle Manx, who also has just got off the plane a little bit quicker. You could have come together in a cab. And her work has been developing educational pathways and is an inspiration for the UK academic community. And we'll be getting a short presentation from Michelle as well. It's talking about the experiences that she's had. And UK is fantastically represented by Dr. Leonie and Sam de Vries of King's College and coordinator of Migration Research Group, and Emma Williams, who is CEO of Student Action for Refugees. We're very lucky to have Baroness Hanway. Thank you so much for coming from the House this evening. And she's graciously joined us to give her impressions of the work in the reunification of refugee families. And she's going to join our first panel. And finally, to collaborate. And this highlights the work of refugee groups, and we've got representation from Bekele, and also, luckily, from Nick Coke of the Salvation Army, who I know has to leave, and has been very kind coming to join us for a short period of time this evening, so thank you, Nick. And Nick Clements of Reset, who is joining with the business community and is going to tell you a little bit more about a new business opportunity, as well as his new charity. And then finally, we've got Pranav Chopra from NEMET, who is doing exactly what we want to do with businesses. And we're absolutely inspired that you're here to join us to share as well. The UK Community Sponsorship Scheme gives local communities the opportunity to assume greater responsibility in the global refugee crisis. Tonight is really about investigating how we can take up a lead role in resettling refugee families into their neighbourhoods, into schools, into universities, and into jobs. However, it needs to go faster and it needs to go further. And the impact that refugees need, as we've seen with the terrible things we've been watching on TV this week, the news today that women are suffering in Syria, even with people who are trying to give them help. So this tonight is all about sharing a message, sharing a story, and doing something about it. So I'd like you to join us to listen to the debate, ask questions, and then join our campaign, which is Be a Refugee Sponsor. Now, if I can introduce us to our wonderful moderator for our evening, our very own Trish Lynch, who is ex-CNN and our IOHR TV correspondent. So thank you so much. If I can pass over to Trish.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you.
And there we go.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Thank you for braving the elements to be with us here today. Now, as Val has said, the world is facing one of the world's worst refugee crises since World War II. And the UK government have undertaken the largest rehabilitation, the largest resettlement of refugees in history. They have agreed to take 23,000 refugees over a 5-year period. That's between 2015 and 2020. And as of December of last year, 2017, 10,500 Syrian refugees have been resettled into the UK. But the government wanted to take that a little bit further, and they introduced the community sponsorship refugee system, which has been an absolute amazing success in Canada. This evening we'll be looking at how our Canadian brothers are doing over there, what they're doing, and how we can learn from them. But we'll be looking at all of that in more detail. But before that, I'd like to introduce you to a man who really is the embodiment of what this scheme is all about, and he really is a success story. To tell us his incredible story, please give a warm welcome to Mohammad Al Saleh.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming today into this really important debate, a debate that can save lives, literally. So, my name is Mohammed, and I am actually a terrorist. Yes, I am a terrorist. I was arrested 3 times in my life, actually. In my short lifetime, I visited 7 different detention centers. In fact, on this very day, 4 or 5 years ago, I was being interrogated in one of them in Syria. But I wasn't born a terrorist, nor did I dream of being a terrorist. Like every kid, I was having my craziest dreams. My first dream was to become a Superman. I guess all kids have these crazy dreams when they are very young. But later on, when I grew up, I had a new dream. And that dream was to be the soccer star Zainuddin Zidane. You guys know him? I love him. But when I figured out that I'm not that fit, I changed my dream, and I wanted to become an astronaut. And that was the final dream. So I went to school and started studying very hard, trying to establish my dreams. But the moment when I knew my real dream was during high school. In my final year of high school, I lost my favorite cousin to cancer. He was only 10 years old. And when they told me there was no cure for cancer, I kept asking, why not, son? Why not? And that's how I changed my dream. I was going to become a doctor and find a cure for cancer. And sure I did. I studied very hard, and I entered the university. And actually, when I became a terrorist, I was a fourth-year medical student. And that was in Homs, Syria. In fact, I still remember that very moment when I was labeled a terrorist. It was in the year 2011 when our nation of Syria was dreaming of having freedom and having basic human rights that people like you in the West enjoy and take for granted. Those were our dreams in 2011. Inspired by the Arab Spring, a nationwide uprising took place. And the Syrian people really wanted to have the same liberating experience as Tunisia and as Egypt. But our president and our dictator had another say. In fact, his response to that, to our dreams was by sending his army to the streets and establishing checkpoints on every major corner. So that way they can prevent any major crowds from gathering. And actually, the security forces written slogans on the walls wherever they came, and their slogan said, "Assad," which is the name of our dictator, "or we burn the country." It was a clear message that they are not really willing to change. But we didn't really believe that this threat was truth, and we continued on revolting against the dictatorship. So back to me. I was a fourth-year medical student. I was living two dreams by that time. I wanted to become a doctor, but in a free country. When I participated in the first demonstration, when I first said freedom loudly and clearly, I felt that this was the first time I hear my voice. Other than that, the memories from my childhood were full of people telling us that walls have ears and we're not supposed to talk about anything. And it was, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this piece, but it was a real-life 1984. And our president was the big brother, and I guess in this story, I am Winston Smith. In 2011, I was driven by my dreams and demonstrating. I was having my phone and filming the uprising. And if you know anything, or if you want to know anything about dictatorships, the first number one rule that everything is policed, and there is no real press and freedom of information. So without even realizing, by doing that and by taking photos and sending them to the outside world, I ended up seeing my videos on CNN and on BBC and on Al Jazeera without even meaning to. And that's maybe my second realization of how important anyone's voice can be and how change starts from the very basic cell of society, which is the individual, the person. However, for that, I had to pay a big price, which is, as I shared with you, being arrested 3 times, being interrogated and tortured in 7 different detention centers. And I don't really need to elaborate more on torture, because that is the worst thing human beings created after war. War is, in my opinion, is the worst thing that we ever created as a species. But what I want to share with you is the fact that after literally having a face-to-face meeting with death and surviving it, the government of Syria was not happy with that. That wasn't enough for them. So they charged me with terrorism. I was charged with 3 charges of terrorism. The first one was establishing a terrorist organization, and that's what they call a demonstration. Conducting terrorist acts, and that's the act of demonstrating. And the third one, which is really ridiculous, is encouraging people to join terrorist organization and to conduct terrorist acts. Oh my God. I was so lucky that my family was able to get me out of Syria. And they only were able to do that by selling the family house and paying a lot of bribes to get me out. And that's how I lost everything I knew in life. I went from being a prospective oncologist, from being a prospective doctor, into being a refugee. Immediately after surviving that experience, I fled to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, life was very, very hard. Lebanon is a very small country that is neighboring Syria. I'm not really sure how to compare it with any place here, because this is my first time visiting the UK. But it is home for about 4 million Lebanese people. And it's a small country where you can drive from one end to the other end in like 3 hours. So this small piece of land is overwhelmed by an influx of 1.5 million Syrian refugees. In fact, every 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. So you can imagine that the already limited resources of the small country are overwhelmed by this influx. And there is no jobs, there is no opportunities for educations. If you look at me, I started trying to take any survival jobs. My first job was painting walls. I waited tables. I worked in a shisha bar. And the final job that I worked in Lebanon was washing cars. And if you have any car to wash, I am happy to do that. I have a lot of experience from Lebanon, so I have international experience. And I started losing hope, actually. I mean, put yourself in my shoes. Put yourself in any refugee's shoes. In one hand, you can try and go back to your home country. Good luck. If you're not arrested, you might get shot by mistake. If you stay at home, there are airplanes 24 hours that are dropping bombs on civilians. And on the other hand, you are in a foreign land that is overwhelmed by another 1 million people that are in the same desperation as you are, and there are no opportunities. And these are the impossible scenarios and impossible decisions that refugees have to make. Nothing makes sense, and everything is forced on you, and you have to survive. Except for the lucky ones. People like me. People who get a really unique opportunity of a new start in a new place, which is called in the refugee world resettlement. So to be resettled is to be identified and referred to resettlement, and to have a third country other than your home country and country of asylum, a third country that is willing to take you in and resettle you and welcome you as a new member of their society. The UNHCR says that there are 8% of the world's refugees that are in need of resettlement, but they only have spaces for 1%, for less than 1%. So back to me and my case, the UNHCR heard my story and heard about my dreams and thought that they might help me. So they've taken my story and tried to find me a resettling country. And after 6 or 7 months, actually, of living under desperation in Lebanon, I received a phone call that changed this whole situation and gave me hope again. And it was the Canadian embassy, actually. So I pick up the phone, and I'm like, yes, this is Mohammad Al Saleh. And the voice on the other end says, well, we heard your story, and you might be eligible for resettlement in Canada. So are you interested? To be honest, that was the most conditional sentence that I've ever heard in my life. The most unpromising promise that I've heard in my life. But I was interested. I said that I am interested. And I was offered an interview the next morning, and I was basically able to share my story. I was able to do what I'm doing right now, which is just sharing my dreams and my experiences and everything that had happened with me. And after a few months of that interview, I arrived in Canada, and that was November of 2014. Now, arriving in Canada or arriving in any new destination for a refugee is not necessarily a fairy tale ending and a happy ending for the story. It's actually the start of a new challenging era, but with different factors. And also it's what I would like to highlight here, maybe in this, is the effects of culture shock and moving to another place, which are actually amplified in the case of refugees. But back to me, and when I arrived, for me, imagine that you are told that you are going to go to the farthest place on the map, to the west. Actually, my email now is like go for West because of this whole concept. But so you're going for West. You're going to the farthest end of the earth to a place called Vancouver. I promise you, I didn't know anything about Vancouver back then. To a place where they speak English, a language that I have to learn. 3 years ago, I didn't really speak English, and my first conversation was at Vancouver International Airport with that awesome Canadian that first helped me and told me, welcome to Canada. But with that sentence, welcome to Canada, my life changed. Because wherever I go, to a coffee shop or to a school or to any service center, the first thing you hear when people learn that you just came to Canada, the first 3 words are welcome to Canada. And with that sentiment and with that acceptance of others and openness to anybody, regardless of their experiences, regardless of the fact if they were charged with terrorism at one time by a corrupt dictatorship, with having that sentiment, we are saving lives in Canada. So fast forward 3 years from now, I am actually giving a talk about my experience in the UK right now with you. My experience have really changed my life. Ever since I was able to learn English and I was able to go back to college and graduate. Right now I work in nonprofit, and my job right now is actually a trainer for the private sponsors, because in Canada we have this unique system that we're going to explore tonight, which allows private groups and private citizens to actually participate in the efforts of resettlement of refugees. And what my favorite part about the private sponsorship program is additionality. Bring in additional numbers of refugees that wouldn't have this experience if it wasn't for the public and for the citizens and for the kindness and generosity of Canadians. The final thing that I want to share with you is the fact that in these last 3 or 4 crazy years of my life, I went from being a doctor to terrorist to a Canadian, but now I am actually a sponsor of refugees. Currently, I am sponsoring my own family. I am sponsoring my own mom and my 5 siblings who are still refugees in Turkey and in Germany. And in order to do that, I was supposed or required, or I had to raise a lot of money, 60,000 Canadian dollars, which was collected in 1 month in December 2015, thanks again to the generosity and kindness of Canadians. And now we have an active application for them, and I'm happy to share with you the happy news that they have just interviewed for their visa interview. They were approved, and we're going to have them in Canada joining us very, very soon. And soon, my entire family will be reunited in Canada. And thanks to the generosity of Canadians, the kindness of Canadians, and the same, or all the positive values that we embrace in Canada, my life was saved, and my family's life was saved. Now, finally, I would like to share with you that when I was fundraising in the year 2015, I was able to meet with the Prime Minister of Canada, the newly elected Prime Minister of Canada back then. He's not new anymore, Justin Trudeau, and share with him my story. But to my surprise, after 1.5 years of meeting him, I met him again. And that second time I met him with Prince William and with Kate, with the future king of the UK. And I remember one of the questions that Prince William asked me, which is about how are people able to overcome the hardship and endure these horrible situations. And Canadian media were not allowed in the room for some reason, so I don't have a recording of that. But I was really struck by his curiosity to know that, because a Syrian refugee family was with us in that room, and I was acting as an interpreter. And I did ask that to the gentleman, to the refugee that have just arrived, who was more fresh than me. And his answer is really something that I want to share with you and conclude with, which is he said that if you are never sick, you will never appreciate health. And then he elaborated and he said, in our case, we've seen the darkest and worst side of humanity in Syria. But it's thanks to people like Canadians and thanks to the generosity of a nation like Canada, we are able to see the other side, so we can appreciate both things and have a complete experience. And having said that, I would like to thank you for your kindness, your generosity, for embracing these values that might save thousands of lives, thousands of additional lives that wouldn't have had the chance to have a new start if it wasn't for you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mohammad Al Saleh there, living proof that the private sponsorship system definitely does work. Over the past 40 years, Canada have resettled 300,000 Syrian refugees, or refugees in general, not just Syrian refugees, and Mohammed is one of them. So thank you for being with us here today. So now we're going to look at exactly what the community sponsorship scheme is, how it works, what's involved, and the various challenges. And to do that, I'd like to welcome my expert panel. If I could ask Major Nick Coke to come and join us, please. Major Nick Coke is a Salvation Army officer for 18 years. Nick leads a local Salvation Army congregation in the southwest of London, as well as coordinating the organisation's national refugee work in the United Kingdom and Ireland. And his church was one of the first groups in the UK to welcome a Syrian refugee family. And they celebrated their anniversary of 1 year last Saturday, so we'll be hearing all about that in a moment. So well done, fantastic there. I'd like to also welcome Bekele Yho Beckley. Bekele, if you'd like to come and join us, please. Now, Bekele has first-hand knowledge of exactly what it's like to be a refugee. He came here 12 years ago from Ethiopia, so he knows exactly what it's like. He is now the Senior Project Manager at Sponsor Refugee, a foundation set up by Citizens UK to promote community sponsorship of refugees. Bekele has been working as a community organiser with Citizens UK for 7 years, so thank you for joining us, Bekele. I'd like to welcome Chris Clemens, please. Chris, if you come and join us, thank you. Chris is the director at Reset, and Reset is a new charity founded to help develop the community sponsorship in the UK. Reset brings together the leading organisations that are active in sponsoring refugee charities, businesses, faith groups and funders. And in the coming months, he'll be launching a national training programme to teach other communities what they need to do to welcome refugees into their community. I'd also like to welcome Baroness Hamwi, Liberal Democrat Lord Spokesperson for Emigration. She is a life peer and a former chair of the London Assembly and is Vice President of the equal rights charity Parity. Thank you very much for joining us. Nick, if I can come to you first. Your community, as I said, welcomed one of the very first refugee families into the UK. Can you just outline what the difference between the government resettlement scheme is and the community sponsorship scheme?
Yep. So the government resettlement scheme involves local authorities around the UK having funding centrally from the Home Office in order to resettle numbers of refugees, and that was voluntary, that local authorities could put themselves forward to resettle numbers of refugees, and that money is funded by the Home Office. In the case of community sponsorship, it's a local organisation, a charity, that is able to do the bulk of that work, so it's not funded in the same way, although families that come through community sponsorship are entitled to benefits and local support from in the area in which they live, but the local group has to orientate themselves, organise themselves to be able to support this family and help the family to do the actual resettlement. So it's a community-based effort as opposed to maybe a local government-based effort.
So what happens? The community get together and they decide that they want to do this. Tell me about the Home Office application process. How lengthy is this? Are there people on hand to help you?
Well, we were one of the first to do it. I mean, so it was all very new when we did it. So the experience of people doing it now might be slightly different, but for us, it was so new that we were sort of working it out a little bit as we were going along. The process is quite lengthy. It took us the best part of a year from making a decision as a local group that we wanted to do sponsorship to actually the family arriving. And that process really involved us being able to put together a resettlement plan, which outlined exactly how we're going to do it, who's in our team, who's going to play what role, how are we going to make that work on the ground, and that's things like organising English classes, discovering which local schools are available, where healthcare is going to happen, how we're going to get them from the airport back to where they're going to live, how we're going to sort accommodation out. So that obviously takes some time, and that's all part of the application process of getting all that information together and preparing yourselves properly. So actually we felt as a group that all we were asked to do and to prove that we were going to do was actually quite helpful, because when it came to delivering, we knew it back to front and exactly what we were able to achieve, and we thought it all through very carefully, and we trained ourselves in that respect as well. So it was a long application, but I think we reaped the benefits of the detail of that.
Now I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here because I know that you have to unfortunately leave us. You celebrated your 1 year anniversary with your new family. Tell me what you've learned in that year, and what can you tell other communities that want to sponsor refugees? What worked and what didn't work?
Well, I think the two main things that we learned. The first one is, I think, that it takes a community to resettle a family, and that community involves many different people. And what we discovered when we started to build our team was that there are all sorts of different people with different gifts and skills that they can bring to the table. So whilst we didn't consider ourselves as experts in refugee resettlement, we are experts in our community. And so in my team, for example, we have a teacher called Claire who has helped the family get into schools and supported them in their schoolwork. We have a doctor in our group who's great on the medical side of things. We've also got a lady called Joan who knows every single bus route in Merton. And you need
Invaluable.
a Joan. You need a Joan as much as you need a doctor in your team, because you need people who are going to be able to sit and welcome and do that befriending bit and know the area really well. So the first thing I guess I would say that we've learned is that it takes a whole community of different people with different skills. We needed Arabic speakers, we needed people we didn't have initially, but we had to gather people together to join the team. I think the other thing we've learned is that it takes a family to make a community, because we've changed as a group, as a community group through the process, and we weren't, we at the end of this are a very different community to one we were at the beginning. And a lot of that is down to the family, because they've taught us so much. I'd say we understand the concept of welcome a heck of a lot better than we did when we started. We thought we knew we were going to be welcoming to this family, but they've actually taught us about what welcome is, because every time we've gone round to their house, they've opened wide the door and they said, come on in, and they've given us food and they've helped to welcome us. So we have been changed by this family, and it means that our community is stronger as a result of that. So for me, we've learned an awful lot about ourselves, and yes, there have been challenges along the way, some practical things that we've had to work out. We understand that it's difficult for a family, as Mohammad was sharing about the actual to be settling into a new country is a massive, massive thing, and so we've had to walk together with that and overcome challenges as we've gone along. But yeah, we are very different people, all of us, for the family and us, over that year.
And just one final question before you have to leave us. You said that it took a year to get the application through the Home Office. Do you think there's a possibility that because it's so lengthy that it might actually put some people off?
Well, I think it's quicker now, so I would say that's the first thing to bear in mind, that I don't think it would take a year for a group today that wanted to start out and get through, and I think there's a lot more support.
Is that because you've done all the hard work for us?
Well,
Yeah.
perhaps. Well, I think part of being one of the pioneers, I guess, is a bit of a risk, because you're doing that. But I think we've all learned a lot of lessons, and I think for the Home Office also, it's all speeding up. So I don't think it will take that long. I think it could put some people off, just the enormity of what you're doing. But personally, I think it's really important to take it incredibly seriously. That what we don't want is people being resettled when they're not properly prepared. I think it's right and proper that groups really consider the amount of work that's involved and do what's necessary to do the best job we can. And I think that's what we felt the weight of. We wanted to do a great job. We didn't know how it was going to go. It's still ongoing in many ways, that we've finished a year, but we're still together with the family, and it will continue. But we wanted to do a great job, and that is worth putting the effort in, I think.
Major Nick Hoke has to leave us now. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for
very
that.
much.
Bekele, if I could just come to you now. Apart from the emotional support that Nick spoke about, what is the first thing that a refugee family needs when they arrive in the UK?
Well, the most important thing, as I always say, is that kind of welcome, which really matters. Because, people will happen in crisis, which they never expected. If you see the Syrians, for that matter, Syria was it was a great country, irrespective of the leadership. Mm-hmm. And then for Syrians to go into that crisis is, it's a big blow. So they would kind of actually look for that kind of welcome. And that welcome, that kind of Nick and others do at the airport is a big deal. It kind of changes, the way they see the world.
Big welcome as they walk through arrivals.
That big welcome at the airport.
Yeah.
It's a big deal, because if you are time thinking that nobody else cares for you, and then you've got people who are waiting for you, waving flowers, balloons, and waving their hands and so on and so forth, waiting for you is a big deal. And then anything else will be additional, because you will have prepared, as a community sponsoring, you will have prepared yourself for that.
So apart from the emotional support and the big welcome, tell me about housing and finance. How does that work out?
Well, when you are preparing yourself to welcome refugees through the scheme, for your information, my organization Citizens UK itself, and as a staff member, we are about to sponsor ourselves as well. So the best deal of work to be done is actually to look for accommodation, which is important. It's an important area to concentrate on. But it is about community sponsorship. So when you have communities, there's somebody who's got links with those who have good accommodation, or or somebody who can top up the difference between the local housing allowance and then the market rate. So when you have communities who have come together to do sponsorship, it kind of brings solutions to challenges that's around. By the end of the day, there's a call for every one of us. There is this crisis. What can we do about it? It's not enough to complain. Are we doing something about it? So despite the challenges that might be around, you can always find solutions to address it. So accommodation can be an issue, but it's something that can be sorted.
How long does the accommodation need to be there for?
Well, the good thing is the Home Office has learned a lot through the process. They have learned it actually from Nick and others. So they are willing even to step in when there is a need. Mm-hmm. So the most important thing is, do we have somebody who is willing to avail their properties so that you can sponsor a family? That's enough for the time being. When you are notified that you are going to have a family, then you can have that agreement. So it's not a big issue for the time being, but what's important is there is somebody who is willing to avail their properties so that a sponsoring family could rent them.
So it's 2 years then? It's a maximum of 2 years,
The commitment is for 2 years. So the commitment with the family is 1 year. So Nick probably might have... What's he gone? So, Nick probably has actually finished his, his commitment on... It's going to finish today, for that matter. Yeah. But we celebrated 1 year on Sunday with them. But the commitment with accommodation, as far as accommodation is concerned, is 2 years.
And what happens if after the 2 year period the family are not fully integrated and they're not independent? Does it continue on?
Well, the most important thing is it is a community sponsorship. When you have a community sponsorship, there are lots of people who have got lots of skills, expertise, and so on and so forth. Some of them would find them, when we go back to Nick's family, he's got gas science, he's official, he's got job now, he's just working, and his wife is also providing food every now and then, which means they are about to be self-sufficient on their own, okay? That's what's important. But at the same time, there's always that relationship with the with the sponsoring family. So as the sponsoring family, even though the commitment is 1 year, it doesn't mean they're going to leave them. But I
looked at your videos on YouTube, and one of the refugee families who had been re-sponsored said that every day they have at least 20 people coming to check they're okay, to take them to the local cinema, to show them where the school is, to help them register with the doctors. So it's lots of people doing lots of little things, isn't it?
It is, actually. Yep. There's no something like small. There are lots of people who are really willing to do it. Yeah. People actually do it voluntarily. They really want to do it on their own. Nobody is going to actually compel them to do it. They want to do it. That's why they are in it. People get stuck in it because they want to get their hands dirty and do and deliver. And they are not going to run away. This is experience in Britain. I think this is experience in Canada as well. That's what I heard as well. So people will not run away from the people they have sponsored.
Chris, if I can come to you now. Restart is a relatively new charity.
Reset, sorry.
Reset. And you basically joined the dots. You put organisations that are interested in sponsoring refugees in touch with businesses and with funders and church groups. Tell me why this is important. Why do you need to marry the two up together?
So we've been working over the last 2 years leading up to the establishment of Reset, and Reset is literally just launching this month. I guess understanding how community sponsorship is growing in the UK, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges? There's lots of interest in sponsorship, and we wanted to really kind of realise that potential, I guess, that we saw out there. Because whilst there's lots of organisations mobilising, we wanted to ensure that they were joining up, that we were learning lessons for how we were supporting people, and ultimately we were enabling more groups to come forward and do this in a good joined up way. So as we did our research, we didn't see a lack of interest. What we did see was there wasn't perhaps the support in place, whether that's kind of formal training or indeed a network of learning amongst the organisations that are starting to do the support that, say, Bekele or Nick are doing. And we wanted to kind of bring those together and join up those conversations so that we can learn from each other and have that dialogue. And I think we also were aware that there were plenty of people out there who hadn't heard about sponsorship, and that there are lots of things going off in lots of different directions. We wanted to help coordinate that work so we can have a joined-up message to sell this out to the communities that haven't heard about it, but not just communities that might get involved in sponsorship, but also that broader kind of whole of society. So whether that's businesses, whether it's universities, whether it's foundations, funders, there's lots of people that are interested in the things that sponsorship can do. And we wanted to have a place where we can bring those conversations together and plug people together so we can really achieve the potential that sponsorship has for the UK.
There's lots of people in the UK that want to help but don't really know how to help. You are launching the national training programme where you're going to travel around the country inspiring people with stories of community sponsorship that's already happened. Tell me how that's going to happen and what it's going to contain.
We're doing two different things here. We're both doing a programme of awareness raising. So when Reset was forming, we had 11 charities, NGOs, faith groups came behind us. In fact, all the organisations that are currently active in sponsorship came together behind Reset, together with some of the established refugee agencies, some of the larger agencies, to say, let's work together on this. So we want to work with and through those organisations to get the message out about sponsorship. So we'll be doing a whole series of promotional work, campaign work, telling the story of sponsorship. And in one sense, that's about empowering the likes of Bekele, who can tell the story better certainly than I can, to be out there and telling that story well. But alongside that, we also want to put in a training programme. So separately, we're also doing work with the organisations that have been active in sponsorship to understand, what is the right way of supporting someone to get the right knowledge so they can do the application form that Nick talked about. How we can draw on some of the good practice that's already around resettlement. So, there are lots of established organisations that have been doing resettlement for years. It would be foolish not to bring that knowledge to the table as well. So with our training programme, we're working particularly in partnership with Refugee Action, National Refugee Charity, to develop a training programme that we can go out and give both face-to-face but also online, through the toolkits, materials, lots of different ways of getting that knowledge out to people who need it, who can then work and get inspired, but know how to move forward. And ultimately through that we hope that the year process that Nick went through, we can shorten that process so that people can understand what it is they need to do and learn. And that's not saying they don't have to learn, because it is important. I'd echo what Nick says, that people go on a journey when they get involved in this. I look around the room and I see there are people that have been on that journey as well, and it's the process of understanding what is right for the community and what is right for the family you're going to welcome into that community. We want to empower those people to understand how to have those conversations and how to move forward with sponsorship.
Baroness, if I can come to you now. Sally, okay, Sally. Having a refugee family ensconced in the bosom of a community, surrounded by all that love and affection, is a wonderful thing, but all their families are back home. Now, I know that you're a strong believer in family reunification.
I am. Can I pick up something that Nick said? He used the phrase, it takes a community to resettle a family. And I don't know whether that rang bells with anybody else, but I thought, and it takes a village to raise a child. There's a very close analogy in that, it seems. Yes, in this country, the sponsorship scheme does not allow the sponsor to name the family. And there are great difficulties in bringing family members into the UK when one member has got here in particular, and this I think has caught the public imagination hugely, a child, in other words, under 18, many of them will be teenagers, cannot sponsor his parents or siblings to come and join him. And families belong together. The government, for all the good things it does, maintains that would be what it calls a pull factor. It would prompt people in conflict situations, or, let's not forget there are other reasons for refugees, and climate change is going to be an increasing one. It would prompt them to send somebody on ahead, somehow to get into the country through very dangerous means often, and that would be a bad thing. I have to say, I don't come across many people who share that view. I've heard it called implausible by people who should know in debate in the Lords. And there are a lot of pull factors. I mean, if you're in a situation where if you don't join a terrorist organisation, you might be in risk of being killed, then your family will send you away. That's push. It's not pull for the UK. I think when people get quite close to Northern Europe, the UK may be a pull factor because of the language. But yes, a lot of us worry about that very much. Alf Dubs, whose reputation is amazing in this area, he's a terrific inspiration, said in a debate, I had a private member's bill on family reunion recently, and he said, we've got to keep public opinion on side, and I think he was spot on with that.
Well, we heard from Mohammad how he's sponsoring his family and they're coming over, so keeping that family unit together is hugely important, isn't it, Bekele?
It is actually. Well, first of all, I sponsored my own family. Because I came here, took me time, took me 4 years actually to get my leave to remain, and became British about 7 years ago. But the process takes so long. It took me 8 years to get reunited with my family. And that's a limitation what the new scheme also has, you know. For instance, the family in Enfield in London, which comes with sponsorship. The wife, the mom and 2 kids are in Enfield, and the husband is in Turkey. And the family who have sponsored them have identified him, but the scheme does not allow it. That's number one. And number two, what Pranav Saleh said, you know, it's really important. Pranav Saleh, yeah.
Just Sally.
Oh,
It's a job title.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
Very impressive job title.
I'm used to it. Yeah. As I said, it's really quite important. You know, it is about community, and it's about family. Family really makes a community, and that changes into, you know, that brings everything together.
I heard a story which I'm sure will be familiar to other people, that the cost of bringing in a family member, particularly in fees, can be so high as to be impossible. And there was some publicity, I think, about a father who was here who could not afford to bring over his daughter, who was in the jungle in Calais when the jungle existed. He had become a British citizen, as you had, because he couldn't afford it, and he was so worried about his daughter, he went to join his daughter in the jungle. That, I think, is a real indictment of the way we deal with refugees.
Nick, the government have pledged to resettle 23,000 refugees over a 5-year period. And as I said earlier, already 10,500 are resettled here in the UK. Do you think it's enough?
I think everybody who's involved in community sponsorship and the resettlement programme would like to see the government do more. I think we should recognise that, certainly in terms of recent commitments around resettlement, this was a big step up from what went before, which was the Gateway programme. So I think we all welcomed the announcement of the Syrian programme, and indeed the progress that's been made against it. I mean, you know, to have over 10,000 now is a step forward. You know, people often talk to me about this point of additionality, which is essentially, should community sponsorship increase sponsorship beyond the 23,000 commitment? And I guess very practically what I say to them is we haven't got to 23,000 yet. What I'd like to see is communities get involved, others to get behind resettlement, so we can hit that 23,000 figure, you know, as soon as we can, because there are people, you know, as it was articulated earlier in the presentation, that need resettlement here and now. There are places that are in our system that we'd like to see filled. So I think there's a challenge then, let's get to 23,000, and then I think we have a much stronger policy case to talk about the 23,000 and first person that might get resettled in. Right now we haven't hit that figure, so it feels like a conversation to have when we're nearer that figure, and you know, that's certainly what I know a lot of people in this room would like to see happen, and I'd probably share that view.
So the 23,000, that's one channel, that's the government resettle. And then the community sponsorship, is that part of that 23?
It's within that figure.
It is within that, actually. So as Chris said earlier, let's see if it's number one working, number one, and let's deliver what's promised, you know, before even the promise of 20,000, 20 plus 3,000. You know, the government promised to bring in 750. They couldn't deliver. They only delivered 190 by the end of 2014, if you remember. So let's see if it's really working. And once we have seen, there are lots of questions to ask. Number one is additionality, and number two is naming. And number three is that diversity. It shouldn't only be to the camps around Syria, elsewhere as well. And there are refugees stranded across the world. That's what Canada is doing. That's what we should be doing. All those things could happen. We can have all those questions, but let's see if we are actually up for this first.
And Sally, if I can just end with you, could you tell our audience here today and people watching at home why the community sponsorship is a good idea?
Harnessing individuals as well as communities, individuals make up the community, harnessing their enthusiasm and altruism is part of what I think leadership should be about. I'd like the government to talk more to the general public about the importance of supporting refugees. There's lots more I'd like to see the government do in order to achieve that. And one of the things, I'm sorry, but I have to put this in, is teaching of English, because language is the most important tool, looking at Mohammed. And the availability of English classes is far too low. A lot of it is reliant on some terrific volunteers, but I've often thought I should be better if I just gave up the political work and undertook some English conversation classes. But frankly, I'm not a teacher. I'm not sure I could do it very well. It does need a professionalism and it needs investment. And the government knows that knowledge of language is a major part of integration. That's not to say that people who come here should become, I was going to say people like me. I'm not very far. Anyone who knows Syria would recognize that my name means that my family came from Hama. And my grandparents were born in Aleppo, and I'm jolly glad to have been born in Manchester. But people like some of us, not to impose the same pattern on those that we welcome, but to make life easier for all of us. Actually, English is hugely important. But to go back to my major point, where the government is leading, it should be promoting leadership. We're doing it, you can do it too.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank our panel, Chris Clements, Sally Hamwi and Bekele Yho Beckley. Thank you. We'll be hearing from Chris in a moment. Thank you. Now, educational pathways are essential to completing the circle and to ensuring that full integration and full independence is achieved. I'd like to welcome now Emma Williams. Emma is the Chief Executive of Student Action for Refugees, also known as STAR, and she's done this job for 20 years. She's 20 years of experience leading refugee non-profits in the UK. Prior to joining STAR, Emma led the programme of national expansion at Freedom from Torture, setting up 4 new treatment centres for survivors of torture. Please welcome Emma Williams.
Hello, everybody. So it's nice to see some friendly faces here. Hi, Chris. We're quite a small world. We just go around the same meetings. Bekele. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about universities and students and how they can welcome refugees. And I'm very, very pleased that you've flown Michelle all the way from Canada because oh, look, I'm on. Because I've been dying to meet her. How do I move this thing? Do you have the thingy? Oh, it does. Okay. I'll keep my hands down. I was approached about 2 years ago. I was at a meeting in Ankara dealing with the refugee situation there. They were looking for models of how students could volunteer with refugees. And I gave a presentation which made all the Turkish activists laugh because I said we have 30,000 asylum seekers arriving in the UK and our papers hate it, and they laughed because they have 3 million who had arrived in a year. So let's just put it in some context about what's happening here. And I was approached at that point by Caritas and UNHCR, who said there's this community sponsorship program and we're interested in how universities and students can help. So I've been very engaged in looking at how we can do that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about STAR. Do you want to just, can someone move it on? Is that possible? We're going to move on? No? Okay, I'll just tell you about STAR. It's okay. So Student Action for Refugees is an example of how students are already helping and universities are already helping refugees arriving. And when I say refugees, I mean refugees and asylum seekers. So we were an organisation that was founded 23 years ago by students. It's student-led. It's 27,000 students strong now, so it's a big movement in support of refugees, and they're organised at 45 universities across the country. And the students do a number of things. One of the main things they do is educate fellow students about refugees and asylum. We have a big problem with negative public attitudes, and I think that this community sponsorship program is going to do a huge amount on public attitudes. I think, to be honest, I'll be absolutely frank, the numbers coming in under community sponsorship are small, but the impact that they're going to have on those people that meet and work and welcome refugees, I think, is going to be huge. As in addition, obviously, to the life-changing effect on those refugees who are brought in through the sponsorship program. I think, we do a lot of work on public attitudes. Public attitudes to refugees are not great in the UK, and they are driving these harsh public policies that Baroness Hanway was talking about. One of the things that the students do is they also volunteer. So we are supporting 4,000 refugees every year through volunteering projects, in fact through conversation clubs, which are in partnership with English language schools. So we have students teaching refugees English, and I'm hoping that those that arrive under community sponsorship will plug into those programs that we're running, also homework clubs, all sorts of stuff to welcome refugees to the community. I think the point to make is that there is already a huge network of support out there, people working, volunteering, and also in paid roles. There is a network, there's a refugee movement that already exists, and this is just sort of building on that. One of the things that we have been working on since 2008 is getting refugees into university. And Michelle from WUSC is going to talk a bit more about the amazing work that they do in Canada, which is, Canada is the beacon of wonderfulness and everything to do with the refugees, as far as we're concerned. We love it. And I do have to make the point that in Canada, the people are allowed to select who they sponsor, and that is the crucial difference. Here you are just sort of allocated somebody, so people cannot sponsor their brother or their parents to come. What we're campaigning on at the moment is family reunion. That's a totally different route. So what Baroness Hanway was talking about is if you're already a refugee and you have your child under the age of 18 or your spouse who is in overseas, you can sponsor them to come here over family reunion. It's incredibly expensive. The fees are very high, but Kaylee spoke about that. And we're running a campaign at the moment. There will be another opportunity for parliamentarians to vote on the 16th of March. We're asking that children can sponsor their parents. We have this bizarre situation where under 18s are given refugee status, their parents are back in a camp on the Turkish border, but they cannot bring them in to look after them, so they're living in care. You also, if you're over the age of 18, you cannot be brought in by your parents. So we're asking for an expansion of that. That's one of the campaigns we're running. Our other campaign is on access to university, and I just want to end on this point, really. Asylum seekers are classed as international students, and they can't work. So if you're classed as an international student, those of you that are sort of slightly younger than me know about student fees, that means that you're charged a high rate of fee. So if a Brit student is charged over £9,000 a year and gets a student loan to cover that, if you're an asylum seeker, you're classed as an international student, you can be charged up to £20,000 a year. You cannot get a student loan, and you can't work. So that means unless you're Boris Berezovsky or one of these oligarchs who comes and gets asylum, you cannot go to university. So we have been campaigning with the NUS since 2008 to, on two fronts. One is to encourage universities to create scholarships, and universities have been amazing. We now have 58 universities that have created over £3 million worth of special scholarships for refugees and asylum seekers. And I'm so proud we have students going through there. There are people who are graduating who have benefited from those scholarships. So universities are really super keen to help refugees. There has been an outpouring. All of these scholarships have been created in the last 2 to 3 years. And my interest really in the community sponsorship is, firstly, I'll be frank, protecting my scholarships, you know. Let's protect the good work that's already happening, the students volunteering in the community, let's plug them into community sponsorship, but also let's make sure that those refugee scholarships are protected, because they're absolutely crucial for those 30,000 that are coming in every year. But secondly, and this is what I'd love to see, is that we are able to bring in, just as they do in Canada, students who have the potential, you know, from Aleppo University, one of the greatest universities in the world. There are amazing scholars who are studying at Aleppo. Let's name them, bring them in and let them study here, rather than this kind of just sort of random people are sent over. So that is my hope, and that's why I'm supporting community sponsorship. Thank you.
Emma Williams, thank you. Please take a seat on our panel. I'd like now to welcome our next speaker. That's Dr. Leonie Ansem de Vries. She is a lecturer in international relations at King's College London and coordinator of the Migrant Research Group. She is active in the King's Sanctuary programme, which comprises a range of initiatives in support of refugees. Here to tell us about the legal pathways, please welcome Dr. Leonie Ansem de Vries.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It kind of brings together a number of things I've been working on in the past few years. And so when I got the invite, I thought that's fantastic. It's just exactly what I want to talk about, really. So that's on the one hand, the King's Sanctuary Programme. So what's done by King's College London to welcome refugees in various ways. But it also links to my own research as part of the Migration Research Group, but also some policy work that we've been doing on legal pathways. Let me tell you a little bit about the King's College London Sanctuary Programme first. So that was established about 2 years ago. And I think this is around the same time as a lot of other universities sort of are waking up to the so-called refugee crisis and want to do something, want to respond in a positive manner. And King's College London, that started out with a number of scholarships, or sanctuary scholarships. So initially that was just 2 a year. That has recently been expanded, and we now have 8 scholarships each year for the forthcoming years, mostly for undergraduate students, but that hopefully will be some for MA students as well. And so that's what King's started doing about 2 years ago. But there were other conversations around that as well, because of course having a scholarship is fantastic, but it's only one small part. And I think what the conversations, also in the previous panel, this panel, have already shown is actually you need much more. You need a village, you need a community, you need all sorts of other provisions. Just giving someone a scholarship is not going to be enough. So King started thinking about that as well, so what other provisions are needed. And I think more generally, King's is quite keen to be sort of a leader in this field and really think about that whole experience. And also not just think about refugees, but think about asylum seekers, but also others. So King speaks about forced migrants. So that might also be people with, for instance, discretionary leave to remain, who don't have refugee status, or people who have sort of other humanitarian visa. So again, it's a broader category. Often the focus is on refugees or people seeking asylum, but there are other categories of people as well who also don't have access to student finance. So that is the key issue. When they don't have access to student finance, there is a need to help them. So the Sanctuary Programme at King's is really, it's an initiative that's led by both students and staff, and we have a very active Star Society as well at King's, and that's very actively involved. So that's one part of that. But of course, as I said, when we have these scholarships, we also need to think about housing, about kind of personal tutor support, about all sorts of other things. I think there are still some issues around that. One of them is also the issue of international fees. And it's really funny, King's as well. So what King's are doing is they are giving these scholarships. So there will be, next year will be 8 students who get these scholarships, and then they charge them international fees, which actually taking away more money from their own scholarships that they're giving them. So they're trying to correct that now, charging them home fees, which just make a lot more sense, because that means actually you can give out more scholarships. But there are also some bureaucratic issues around that. So hopefully they will be able to push that. Now, in addition to that, there's also research going on. So we're thinking also, actually, we need to also better understand what's going on in Syria and Lebanon, but also in other places. So part of my own research, I've looked at the so-called European migration crisis and looking at what is happening in so-called spaces of transit across Europe. So both the very formalized spaces, detention centers, hotspots, but also the very informal spaces, such as Calais, but also in Greece, Italy, and so on. So what are the conditions of people there? And what are the effects of migration management policy? So what are the effects of the fact that people can't get visas, that borders are being closed, that people are being detained, and so on? But we're doing other research as well, especially also on the conditions of children, and what are the effects as well, the health effects, both physical and mental health effects on children and young people as well. At the same time, another part of this program, which I think is also very interesting, and this is also where King's is trying to really push things, is by involving students, and not just that, so giving students the opportunity to volunteer, but also accrediting that volunteering. So we're doing a big push at the moment to try and have official accreditation for students. So let's say they want to go in a volunteering program, so we can send them to Greece or to Italy or elsewhere. And by doing that, they'll get credits that then will be part of their degree at the end. So in that degree, they will have, you've done courses A, B, and C, and you've done this volunteering program as well. It's going to take a few years, but it's one of the things we're at the moment working on. So we already have, we're setting up programs where students can volunteer in Greece, in Italy. There's also an online program, it's called Bekele Yho, where it's sort of English language teaching online for refugees who are displaced at the moment in Jordan and Lebanon. So that's another aspect that we're looking on. And then different faculties and departments have their own initiatives as well. So dentistry, for instance, students in dentistry have gone to Lebanon and give free dentist treatments. There's a legal clinic from law students and so on. So there's all these different initiatives. And where King's wants to go, because we're doing this, but I think there a lot more can be done. And it's exactly where we link it up to the theme of this event as well. King's are very keen to also take this a step further and see if King's can also be a community sponsor and sponsor either a family or also a student to come and study at King's. Of course, it would be best if it is a whole family, and then whoever can be a student, can be parents and children both. Link that in again. So, as we heard earlier, you think about housing, you think about healthcare, and because we're working on all these aspects, trying to link that all in as well as the widening participation issue. Because one aspect as well that's at the moment problematic in some ways is that a lot of universities are very hesitant of what they call to drop grades. So not take into account other types of circumstances to say, okay, in order to get study at university, you need to have, let's say, AAB in your A levels, and that's it. King's is trying to take sort of contextual circumstance into account a bit more. Other universities, I think, are better at that. So that's, I think, an aspect that we really need to work on as well. And what's been said about the difference between Canada, when you can name a person who can come over, and the community sponsorship scheme. I think it's a difference between a private sponsorship scheme and a community sponsorship scheme. So for the private sponsorship, you can name who can come, and I think also the student scheme in Canada is more a private one, and community sponsorship, that's not possible. So I think there are things to be worked on there, and I'll be very keen to hear also what others have to say. I don't know whether it's time to speak about my research now as well. No? Okay, I shall shut up. We have done some research on legal pathways more generally. Community sponsorship is part of that. If you're interested in that, come and speak to me. I've got a policy paper, and if you're interested, I'm happy to give it out.
Please come and join us, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Anson de Vries. I'd like now to welcome our final panellist, that's Michelle Manx. Michelle is the Manager for Campus Engagement and Student Refugee Programme at the World University Service of Canada. The Student Refugee Programme, also known as SRP, is a small resettlement programme that provides opportunities for refugees where it operates to continue their post-secondary studies in Canada. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. I thought I was leaving the cold weather behind in Canada and coming to warmer climates, but it turns out that it came the wrong week. And I'm sorry for bringing the cold weather with me. I leave on Thursday, so it should be over by Friday by the time I go. I am the Senior Manager of the Student Refugee Program at an NGO in Canada called World University Service of Canada. We are actually an international development organization, but our history actually dates back to the 1920s and came out of a student mobilization in Europe. So as much as we like to say that Canada is great at refugee resettlement, student engagement in providing displaced students with continued opportunities to pursue their studies actually originated in Europe. It's still very much part of what we do today in Canada. So, as we mentioned, the Student Refugee Program is part of Canada's community sponsorship model, or our private sponsorship of refugees program. And it allows students to come to Canada with Canadian permanent residency and to pursue their education at post-secondary institutions, either a college or a university or a polytechnic across the country. And currently we engage about 80 institutions, which is almost all of our universities and a growing number of colleges or polytechnics, technical institutions. And we've been doing this program since 1978, since the community sponsorship program was developed in Canada. But we were actually doing the program in a different way before the community sponsorship model existed. So it is possible to do education schemes without having the immigration infrastructure that allows you to do it. You just have to find your way around it. I don't want to give you a full lesson on Canada's immigration infrastructure, but we are a sponsorship agreement holder. So that means that as an organization, we have an agreement with the Canadian government which allows us to sponsor a certain number of students and to also delegate that responsibility to institutions or to universities in Canada once we have verified that they meet all of the minimum criteria, which I imagine is what the UK government does with the sponsors that are becoming community sponsors now. So we work with student groups across the country, and there must be a minimum of 5 students on that student group. And typically, most of our sponsoring groups are youth with the support of a faculty or a staff person on campus, or sometimes both. Our sponsorships are estimated at around $20,000 to $30,000 Canadian, so about 10 to 15,000 pounds, I guess, is the conversion these days. And it really requires, much like community sponsorship requires the whole of community approach, a whole of institution approach, and partnerships at all levels of the institution with the admissions office, with residences, international offices, student groups. And I'm happy that you highlighted the admissions piece, because it is one important factor of admitting refugee students and understanding their background. And so part of what our student groups do is also raise awareness with admissions and registrars about the challenges that students face with regards to accessing documentation, or that they may have had interrupted studies that are inexplicable without having a greater understanding of the context that they face, either in their country of asylum or in their countries of origin. So much like STAR's student groups, our student groups are also responsible for raising awareness on campus about refugee issues, about the barriers that they face in accessing education, about newcomers, and breaking down some of the stigma and stereotypes that that we may have towards newcomers. And then the big piece that they do is they sponsor refugees. They support their integration socially, academically, and financially. Those 20 to 30 Canadian dollars, those are raised in a number of different ways. So again, much like the integration is collaborative, the funding is collaborative. So institutions across Canada commit to providing tuition waivers, accommodations waivers, meal plan waivers, which significantly decrease the costs of a sponsorship. And the remainder of the fees, or the remainder of the funds, are raised through a student levy or a staff and faculty levy, and then through fundraising. Because students come to Canada as permanent residents, it means that beyond their first year, they're able to access the same type of funding that Canadian students have access to. So bursaries, loans, scholarships, employment without restriction on campus and off campus, and to support themselves in the same way that all Canadian students support themselves. And I think this is a really important consideration for developing education schemes, is that durable status, which means that they're allowed to stay once they graduate, and the benefits that permanent residency brings with regards to supporting yourself financially after the first year. The other thing that our student groups do is partner with different offices on campus to offer employment opportunities for the students that come through our program. So whether it's with the registrar or the meal service provider or the library, it provides students with that initial work experience that is required in order to get further Canadian work experience. Because that's a bit of a catch-22. You can't often get a job in Canada if you don't have Canadian work experience, but then how are you supposed to get, So our student groups work to establish those jobs before the student even comes to Canada so that they can begin working right away, part-time, gain some experience, and then apply for jobs in the future. As I mentioned, our student groups raise awareness in a diverse ways. From anywhere from creating what they have called mock refugee camps, to tabling, to taping people to walls with duct tape, as it offers an opportunity to discuss refugee education and the barriers that they face while you're doing activities like this, and it raises awareness about issues in creative ways. And all this with the objective of changing the public narrative. It's important for us to tell the positive stories, and talking about the experience of students and young people and what they go on to do beyond their education is often attractive to the media. And so one of the other activities that students do is they engage with the media on these issues, and our students get involved in the awareness raising on their campuses and in their communities. I think we often underestimate the benefit that Canadians take from participating in programs like this. Often the emphasis is on what do refugee students gain by participating in this program? How have you saved the refugee student? And I think it's important to remember that volunteers take as much from these experiences as refugee students do, if not more so. Their families do, our communities do, and that initiatives like this and community sponsorship create lasting bonds and also lasting commitments to refugee issues. So our program is a small one comparatively when looking at the scope of the refugee crisis. If 150 students a year is a drop in the ocean, but I think it's important not to underestimate the impact of an initiative like community sponsorship and like education schemes, because the young people that engage in these programs, or the people that engage, translate that further into their communities, into their employment in the future, and become long-term advocates for refugee issues. I'm showing this slide because Jessie Thompson was a student volunteer at the University of Toronto many years ago and has become one of the biggest Canadian advocates for refugee issues, and is director now at CARE Canada. And she said that this program has completely reoriented her life path. And we hear that time and time again. We work with thousands of students across the country. And it's difficult to meet someone who doesn't say how important the program was to them in their lives as students, and to creating greater understanding about refugee issues, and not just refugees, but newcomers in general, immigration, and global conflicts and refugee crisis. How am I doing on time? So some of the important considerations, I would say, from our 40 years of doing this, some of the things that we've learned. I already mentioned that the legal status is important for students' ability to access social services, healthcare, financing. I talked about the whole of institution approach. Long-term commitments are also important from institutions, as it allows you to predict how many placements you might have. And so if you're thinking about working with the UK government to identify students for this initiative, you need to be able to know in advance how many placements you'll have. And so these long-term agreements with institutions could help with that. For us, one of the most important aspects of our program that has made it so successful is the peer-to-peer support model. So having youth support other youth and their integration, as it creates a social network upon arrival for those individuals, and using campuses as what we call micro-communities. So rather than being thrown out into the streets of London when you first arrive, possibly from a refugee camp in Kenya, which is the case for some of our students, it's less overwhelming to arrive on a campus where you're well supported by your professors, by the institution, and by a student group that's there to help you navigate the services on a smaller scale before you have to go out and find employment and deal with adulting, as we say in Canada. And then I think it was Chris that mentioned the training for volunteers and how important that is to the success of an initiative. So making sure that Canadian, or in your case, English volunteers are trained, and also the training that we offer to students before they come to Canada. So students go through language training, and they take the IELTS test, which is the English proficiency test that our institutions require before coming to Canada. Advanced computer classes in some cases, that will not be an issue with the Syrian students who surpass us in their computer skills. And then I guess finally looking at that piece about increasing the number of durable solutions, while still working to ensure that those who are in your country already can benefit from similar opportunities, and breaking down the barriers that refugees face. So we use our program as an entry point to have these discussions with admissions offices, as I mentioned, to create greater understanding and break down the barriers that refugee students face if they don't have an organization like ours advocating on their behalf. So they don't need someone like myself calling up the admissions offices of 80 universities across Canada saying, please admit this student, this is why they didn't do well, give them a chance, they'll show you that they can become doctors and lawyers and government officials. And then just to reiterate your point, ensuring that these opportunities are not just available for Syrian students. In Canada 2 years ago, when there was a big push for Syrian refugee sponsorship, there were a lot of initiatives that were created specifically for Syrians when many refugees have been resettled to Canada for decades who did not benefit from the same type of initiatives that were created recently for Syrians. And that, the effect of that was that it creates, obviously, inequity, but tensions between different populations. And it's important to be mindful of those as you move forward, I think. So our role as an organization is to train student groups to ensure that they have the knowledge and skills to participate in community sponsorship. And because students come and go, this is a constant work for us. Every year brings a cohort of new students. We identify students overseas before they come to Canada. We provide them with, or we work with the different organizations, one of them being the British Council, to ensure they have the training to come to Canada and study within some of our bachelor's degree programs. And we negotiate with admissions offices, as I mentioned. And I think I'll leave it there for now. And then if anyone has any questions, I'm available. And also we've developed, because people have been asking us, how does the Canadian model work? We've developed a guide that breaks it down so that different countries can pick the pieces that are applicable to them and explore it further for their own contexts.
Michelle Manx, thank you. Please come and join us. If I could come to you first, the programme that we've just heard about from Michelle, I know it's early days in the UK. Could you see a programme like that working here in the UK?
Let me tell you the great irony, which is her boss is my cousin.
It's a small world.
It is a very small world. And when I got my job 10 years ago, people were going, you really need to talk to Chris. So I have now spoken to Chris. I mean, this would be the dream, right? It would be amazing. It would be totally amazing. And obviously, you know, as soon as the sponsorship came in, I was like Facebooking Chris, going, "What are we going to do?" And he introduced me to Michelle. So yeah, that is my dream, and I generally get my own way. So we just need to make it happen.
Now, I know you said that there's lots of obstacles in the way at the moment. What do you think is a major obstacle?
To be frank, I think I think there's two answers to that. One is that I was just saying, you know, the other funny thing is that I've never met Leonie before, you know, that actually everything that WSC is doing is applicable to the work that we're doing with refugees who are already here. So all that model is kind of what we're doing, and I was going, we can nick that bit. So it's nice to kind of know that, you know, those 30,000 that are coming in, you know, as asylum seekers can access this through the scholarship. So that's the good bit. You know, the challenge really is this, that you can't name your student. So WSC, you know, do a call out and people can apply. This sponsorship program is based on, you know, the community here being sent really sort of people who have been selected by UNHCR, and there is no there's no connection. So, you know, the student piece is one piece, but, you know, the majority of refugees who are sponsored in Canada come to join family members. They're sponsored by family members. That's the reality. So I think that's the obstacle. But, you know, we need to get this one right. You know, now we've got this thing launched. We're going to have Chris making it all perfect, and then the next stage will be that. That's my hope.
Leonie, you touched on the legal pathways. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, so that is some research we've done which really came out of the earlier research on the conditions of people within Europe. And what we realised is that the reason that people are sort of illegalised and taking very dangerous, very lengthy, very expensive routes is not because that's the best way of coming here, it's because there's no other routes available to them. So legal pathways are inaccessible. But of course, legal pathways exist because we are all using them, right? We take an airplane, we get a visa and so on. But for people seeking refuge, there is often no legal way of getting to Europe or wherever they want to get to. So that's what we were looking at and thinking about what legal pathways do exist, how do they operate, and how can we expand them. So in the work we did was really, in some ways, just getting an overview of what pathways exist. And actually, there are an awful lot. So there are different resettlement schemes. So we've got the main UNHCR resettlement schemes, but there are other ones as well. We've got various different visa options and other provisions such as family reunification. And community sponsorship and private sponsorships are part of that, as well as sort of student visas. So we've sort of, first of all, we've just mapping what does exist and where, how does it operate, what are the challenges, how much does it cost? So that's what we've done. And then looked at actually, what can we do to improve, what can we do to expand them? What can we do to integrate different pathways? Because, of course, if we think about some pathways work better for some people. So if you think about, for instance, the most vulnerable people are often being picked up through UNHCR resettlement because that's one of their criteria, it's the main criteria. But thinking about students, those might be a different group of people, younger people, but also who might be, so they might still be very vulnerable, but they might be less so. So thinking about integrating, combining, and creating like a comprehensive program that is fit for different types of people. So that's what we've been working on. And through that, and through the work I've done through the Sanctuary program, we've got this idea of actually, what if we bring sponsorship together with a student scheme? That would be fantastic.
And Michelle, can you tell me what happens to refugees when they finish their education, when they graduate? Do they tend to stay in Canada or do they leave? What happens to them?
I would say that the majority stay in Canada. We tend to work in very protracted refugee situations that where students have come from conflicts that persist, so it's still not possible for them to return to their home country. But still about 10% leave Canada and either go back to their country of origin or back to their country of asylum and become contributing members of those communities. And it really depends on what students have studied. So as I mentioned, some become doctors, some become lawyers, some become government officials. Many will sponsor their families because we do have that immigration infrastructure that allows them to do so. And then they become support people for their families, and they help their younger siblings through school and access higher education. So it really varies depending on the student.
If I could just come to you now. When we look at the Canadian model, where they come through the educational channel and they're permanent residents, do you think that this would ever be the case in the UK?
I can't see why not. I can't see why not. I think for us, it's the idea of what we call safe and legal routes. We're currently in a situation where there are more displaced people than there ever have been before, and more refugees than there ever have been before. We're in a very, very dangerous time. However, the number coming into the UK has just completely dropped because the borders are so closed. And this is why you're seeing over 3,000 people a year drowning in the Mediterranean, because they cannot get in. The first thing that happens when there is a conflict is that visa restrictions are slapped on that country, and people cannot get in and they cannot get out. And countries do not give passports to their dissidents. They don't want them to come here complaining, So it's about the international community going back to what we said we would do in the founding of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Refugee, which was after the Second World War, when so many people fled and so many people were murdered. Millions of people were murdered during the Second World War, and millions of people were refugees, and therefore the United Nations was founded, therefore the Convention on the Rights of the Refugee was founded, and we all signed in and we said, yes, we will protect them. So I think, if we can just remind ourselves that there, but for the grace of God, go all of us. And there is a huge groundswell of support. I never thought that I would see the day in 2015 when I walked down the road, there's 150,000 people around me going, refugees welcome. It was extraordinary. And that ethos is still there. I think, that's why things like the community sponsorship program are so good. It's about giving people an avenue to show their support and then ask our political leaders for change.
Can I,
yes,
just
please.
to add to that, I think also what's really important is the current context of the Global Compact on Migration and Refugees, to which the UK is signing up. Legal pathways are part of that, and the principles underlying that are firstly, the fundamental rights for individuals, and secondly, responsibility sharing and solidarity among states. And legal pathways are explicitly mentioned there, and that's the way we should go. But also changing the narrative from one that is all about risk and security when we speak about migration to one that is about solidarity. So I think it's sometimes also just important to remind people in the UK as well as the rest of the Western world that actually we have signed up to this. And really try and push and change that narrative. And what people were saying earlier, I think that community sponsorship scheme can actually do a lot in that as well, because it is on the ground. And when people work with people and see people, it's often very different when there's sort of an abstract idea of some sort of danger coming in. So I think that's a really important way of stimulating that.
Well, thank you, ladies. I think we have to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Emma Williams. Michelle Manx and Dr. Anselm Devry. Thank you, ladies. So we've talked about the community sponsorship, we've talked about the educational pathways. Now it's time to talk about the business pathways and see ways that big business can join the dots and help those refugee agencies that are trying to help them. I'd like to welcome our panel. Thank you, ladies. Pranav Chopra is our first panelist. If I could ask you to come, please, and join me. Pranav is a passionate social entrepreneur and has been involved in a number of ventures with a social development agenda at its core, ranging from empowering refugees by selling specialist teas in the UK, tackling the issue of literacy in India through the power of tourism, and reducing food wastage in Australia. He also has a strong corporate background, being a strategy consultant for 10 years and a qualified chartered accountant and an MBA graduate. Thank you for joining us. I'd also like to welcome back Chris Clements. Chris, if you could just come and join us again. Chris is the director of Reset. As we said earlier, it's a new charity founded to help. And if we could also bring back our very first speaker, that is Mohammad Al Saleh, who we heard from earlier. He is the Syrian refugee who's now settled in Canada and working full-time to welcome other refugees into the country. Pranav, if I could just start with you, please. Can you outline to me your business and what role refugees have in that?
Absolutely. So I founded NEMI about 1.5 years ago, and NEMI is a London-based social enterprise, which is a tea company where we employ refugees within the business to help them integrate.
Yeah.
And what they're doing is actually we run tea stores around London food markets, in fact, right across the country, where they come in, brew fresh chai, so Indian chai tea, but it's also giving them an opportunity to engage with customers. So that's where they improve their confidence, work on their English skills, just their general communication skills. And we really help them break those silos because they tend to stick within their communities, and this is just an opportunity to engage to the outside world. So that's what we're trying to do at NEMI.
And when did you come up with this idea? What inspired you? What motivated you to do this?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. Started about 2 years ago, in fact. Went to a community cafe in North London, in fact. It's called Hornbeam Cafe. And it's a communal sort of restaurant where you sit next to sort of, random people and, you sort of engage with them in terms of, who are you, what do you do, etc. So sitting next to me, I still remember, it was Anwar, who is who's from Sudan. He's a journalist, political journalist, and I later found out that he's a refugee. He's been here for 4 years. Applied for about thousands of jobs, and the constant feedback he got was he doesn't have local work experience. And if you think about it, how is one meant to get experience if you don't give them the opportunity? So that's where I decided to quit my corporate sort of world and start up NEMI. So that's the story behind it.
So where do the refugees that you employ come from?
Literally right across the globe, really. So we've had as I mentioned, Anwar from Sudan. We've had from Bangladesh, Eritreans were the first ones that we worked with. We've got 2 Iranian brothers as well at the moment. Just from everywhere, really.
Have most of them been unemployed for a while before you took them under your wing?
Quite a few of them, yes.
Yeah.
So, but recently we've got more students on board as well. So yeah, unemployed as well as just a lack of sort of opportunity to enter universities because of sort of poor English skills, and they're working on that whilst they work at the tea stores.
What would you say to people that say they're coming over here, they're taking our jobs? What response would you give to that?
It's I guess it's a matter of giving the newcomers an opportunity. They are here not on a holiday. They're here because they've been pushed out of their their countries. So they want to contribute back to the society. So I guess we've got to welcome them with open hands.
Do you think that the narrative on refugees has changed in this country when people can actually talk to them and interact with them on your tea stalls?
Oh, absolutely. As in, on both sides, really, because it's such a sort of informal setup at the food markets where both the refugees have completely changed, like in terms of, you've got to see the progress that has happened since day one till now, as well as on the community. You'll be surprised like how everyone is very supportive. They really want to learn about their stories and about their culture. So yeah, definitely the narrative has changed and there's been a lot of support.
And do they stay on your tea stalls for long, or do they tend to stay there for a while and then move their way up through the company?
It's varied. We've had students who've worked on their English, passed their IELTS exam, which is the entrance exam to the universities, and they've gone on to one's studying journalism, and another one is a dentist. Whereas Anwar worked with us as a journalist for quite a few months, and now he's a freelance journalist. So it's, completely varies.
I suppose it's important to know, and we have living proof here, that you were in your 4th year in med school, and then you were washing cars in Lebanon. So it's not unskilled people all the time, is it?
No, absolutely not. They're very highly skilled and impeccable English skills as well. So it's not a given that they've got poor English skills at all. Like, I was very surprised, and that's something where I was shocked that lack of local work experience is the only hindrance for them getting into the UK workforce.
Mohammad, you were washing cars in Lebanon. Were you happy to do that, being a 4th year med student?
Absolutely not.
No.
But there's more to that, because it's all about how the community is embracing the fact that there is refugees out there. In the context where I was washing cars, I was washing cars from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And it's ridiculous that there was a curfew in place after 7 for Syrians. So if you're a Syrian, you're not allowed to be in the streets after 7 p.m. So there is that, but if you want to survive, you have to work until 9. So there are more and more obstacles that are being put to, I wouldn't say discourage, but to kind of regulate that overwhelming number of refugees coming in. And what is missing here in this picture, in my opinion, is the fact that instead of dealing with this refugee influx as a problem, try to treat it as a solution. Because in Lebanon, Syrians are the backbone of many industries, especially the jobs that local people and Lebanese citizens do not really want to take, especially and it's known in Lebanon that the building and making buildings, there is a word for this in English, I forgot it. It's construction. There you go. Thank you so much. This is the Syrians that are doing that. Whereas working in gas stations, the Egyptian workers are taking that. It's kind of unwritten rules when it comes to employment. And if this sentiment is embraced, I think a lot of things will change in Lebanon and in other industries, because I think values, first research combined with values are what shapes the policy and what shapes the outcome of that policy.
Chris, tell me how businesses can be involved in refugee resettlement here in the UK.
They can get involved in many different ways, and perhaps in order to highlight how they can get involved here in the UK, it would be helpful again to look across the water to our Canadian friends, because if you take the sponsorship programme, it's really interesting to see that they both played a really crucial role in kind of facilitating resettlement work, but also getting directly involved, and perhaps just to highlight 2 of those. Because in Canada, when you talk to people involved in resettlement, they talk about the importance of this kind of whole of society approach to supporting resettlement. Nick put it well earlier when he said, it takes a community to resettle a family. And of course, community involves business. It doesn't just involve business, it also involves, whether it's universities we've been talking about this evening, or other NGOs or government in its different guises. But it's important that they all come around together, and business has got a real crucial role to play. So in terms of the facilitating solutions kind of side of things, perhaps the most well-known example of that is around the recent Syrian crisis. A number of the businesses came together and put together a kind of an emergency fund. I think they raised, it was 18 million Canadian dollars in a very short period of time, and that was deployed through the government's resettlement programs to particularly overcome some of the challenges around housing and housing costs. Now that was that involved money and was a very kind of big thing that happened. But at a more local level, when I've been over in Canada and talked to people there, I've heard stories of local chamber of commerces getting involved, kind of business networks, playing their role, supporting those that are involved in resettlement, finding ways of practically supporting and helping. On the kind of more direct action side, you know, we've heard here in the UK already there are some businesses that want to enable their staff to get involved in supporting resettlement, whether that's, you know, allowing their staff to support you know, sponsorship arrangement. You know, we've heard others that want to get involved on the fundraising side to help you know, capacity build and provide money for local groups. And then, of course, the obvious one, of course, is job opportunities and you know, examples that we've heard on the panel this evening. But you know, for those that are able to provide work placements or actual roles, you know, it's a very practical thing they can do. So lots of different ways, I think, is the honest truth. But it's not always the obvious things of, well, can they find employment? Actually, there's lots of practical things that businesses do as part of that role, as part of a community.
Are there any financial...
Can I interrupt you 1 second, just to follow up from that? We're very lucky. Jim Estelle, who is a Canadian who has taken over 200 refugees in Canada, has sent a video message for us tonight. He wasn't able to come from Canada, but if I can just run a film, it'll follow up from what Chris is talking about.
I totally believe in refugee sponsorship, and I believe that the people who can do it the best are companies, because we have the resources, we need staff, we know how to train staff, and my experience has been we've got a lot of really good, hardworking, loyal, well-meaning people who work very, very hard and do a great job. I've had so many learnings. One learning point is to get people working as soon as they have any inkling to work, because sitting at home and not working, or even going to ESL full-time, creates a problem for people getting into the workforce later. So that's one of my key learnings. Well, the primary thing that private sponsorship offers over government sponsorship is a focus on jobs. So success for us is people working, speaking English, some degree of integration, and I believe that's easier under business sponsorship than under government sponsorship. I would certainly speak to anybody, help anybody in any way that I can to help more people help more people. That's part of the goal. When I first started, my goal was to sponsor 50 families. I'm now at 58 families, bringing in another 4, so I'll be at 62. But I changed my goal when I started to get press to inspire other business leaders to do something similar to me. So I'm clearly very happy to share any of my learnings and any of my materials, and anything I can help with, I'll definitely do it. Do the right thing. Be a refugee sponsor.
Chris, Jim is still there, is really an inspiration to all of us, but there must be some challenges along the way. It can't all be plain sailing. What do you think would be the main challenges in sponsoring refugees?
I mean, I think it depends on kind of how businesses want to get involved. On the practical sponsor refugee point that Jim has you know, personally done in Canada, you know, the system here in the UK is slightly different. So the UK sponsorship programme is designed around charities or community interest companies taking the lead role. So at the moment there isn't the legal framework for a business to become a sponsor. That's not to say they can't you know, get involved in their community and partner with a charity, but there is that kind of slight glitch, if you like. You know, I think the biggest thing is the businesses that want to get involved in sponsorship, that they're typically businesses that are involved in their communities, and you can't get involved and do sponsorship unless you know your communities, because sponsorship is about connecting the family with everything that's around there in that communities. So those that have those connections will be really well placed to do sponsorship. Those that are perhaps less engaged, it's an opportunity for them to get involved in their communities, and would really welcome them to do that so they can get involved.
Pranav, how would you encourage other businesses to follow your excellent example?
I guess it's just taking the opportunity in any sort of form of business that you take to get any, I guess, body of people, get them involved within the business. Mm-hmm. So in my case, it's refugees that I'm targeting. But you know, there's other sort of social enterprises in London that are employing homeless people, ex-offenders, etc. So if you've got the passion to make a difference, just go ahead with it and reach out to bodies such as the ones that have come out over here today. I actually reached out to pretty much about 20-30 refugee bodies when I wanted to start this. So if you've got the passion, just, I guess, do it.
What was the main challenge that you faced?
There's just been so many, really, but it's been a fun journey. I guess one of the first ones initially was actually to find refugees, which is very surprising, you would think, but that was a big challenge in itself. But just setting up, especially around the legislation, the legality side of things, was also something that I wasn't aware of. So just every step of the way, really, there's been challenges, but when you do overcome those, it's a really satisfying feeling.
Chris, what do you think needs to happen next to get more businesses involved?
In one sense, we just need to connect with those businesses and get them involved. I mean, there are a few challenges, but these aren't unsurmountable. And for those that want to get involved, we at Reset are really keen to engage. Part of our role is, I talked earlier about how we want to inspire and engage people and equip and train, but actually we also want to connect and convene and help businesses find a way to get involved in this. If there's businesses out there that want to get involved, we want to hear from them. We want to help them on that journey and find the right way of them getting involved, whether it's through sponsorship or indeed the other ways that businesses can contribute to the wider refugee issues in this country. There's lots of ways to connect them, get in touch, and we'll help them do that.
I'd like to open it to the floor now. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask our panel?
Or maybe just I'd like to add one important thought to these awesome ideas, which is the fact that research actually shows that refugees and immigrants in general have more tendency of creating their own businesses. So they actually end up creating jobs. It's smaller businesses than other established Canadians, or maybe in his context not Canadian, but I mean the concept of creating businesses, creating more opportunities, hiring Canadians. We have examples of that. The one that comes to mind is Peace by Chocolate, the initiative that was established by Tarek Hadhad in Nova Scotia, the soup factory that was just established in Calgary is another example. And now 2 years later, after refugees have arrived, Syrian refugees have arrived to Canada, we're starting to see more and more of that trend. And I think that's one very important trend that comes with resettling refugees. After a while, I really hear you when you say it might be hard to find them, because guess what? They are, so busy learning English or dealing with the culture shock and the trauma of moving. And there might be a period of time where people cannot really be found because they are so busy doing so many things or facing so many challenges all at the same time. But after a while, we have a living example of Canada of seeing more and more of people creating jobs, and when they don't create jobs, they take jobs that locals don't want, and that's a really important factor that a lot of countries, many countries, not just Canada, many countries need people who are motivated and would do anything to start a new life.
Have you found that local people just don't want to do this job?
There's been interesting stories along the way, but in our sort of experience, they want to as well, the locals as well, but for us, it's a matter of really empowering the refugees, so we're focused on actually giving those opportunities to specifically refugees.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Anybody like to ask our panel any questions?
I'd like to ask the first one, if I can. Get to my prerogative. Imagine I'm a new CEO and I want to start doing this from scratch. Where do I begin? And what are the 3 things that you could tell me that would save me a year in the thinking and the planning?
Well, I'd like to start answering. I wouldn't give you a full answer, but I will start by navigating this question by learning and really benefiting from other people's experiences. And another Canadian example that comes to mind is the Refugee Career Jumpstart. It's an initiative of empowering refugees by employment that was created by immigrants and former refugees, where this really active team of volunteers helps empowering refugees by giving them job readiness training, resume readiness training, finding placement and matching programs between employers and people who are interested in jobs. Maybe one of the 3 things that I would highlight is the same thing that was brought by you, is looking for those who have been here for a while, those who have made some progress, especially in terms of English, because I've seen it, and it might be, you might run into situations where people don't really want to take a job. And it's not that they don't want to take it, but when I talk more to people who do, I find out that it's actually they are really afraid from the idea of taking an entry-level jobs and being stuck in there. And then they would tell me, no, I would like to wait, I would like to learn more, I would like to gain more skills in order for me to have an opportunity to have better jobs in the future. And that's number one from me. Maybe you can get the rest from my colleagues here.
Absolutely. Well, the main one for me is actually just collaborate, really. Our progress has just significantly sped up since we've met like-minded bodies, so including different refugee bodies, including other social enterprises that are empowering all sorts of sort of bodies of life, rather than not just refugees. So you learn from others' experiences. So as a CEO, it's we don't know it all. So and like personally, I don't come from background of refugees and crisis, etc., or also from the food and beverage industry. But it's just a matter of connecting with like-minded people, and you'll be surprised of how passionate and supportive people are. So.
What about you, Chris? Have you anything to add?
I guess some of the comments, but I guess I'd put it as don't reinvent the wheel, because there are plenty of people that have thought about some of these things before, whether it's overseas or indeed here in the UK. Reach out, find out what's worked and what hasn't worked. It'll be different in their particular context of that, whoever that person is, their geography, their industry, whatever they want to do. But reach out, get support, and find out how to shortcut that process. Because if it's taking a year, let's make it take 6 months.
And this gentleman just here.
My question was a major reason why a lot of people are reluctant to buy into these programs is because of this narrative, where people look at this entire issue in terms of security. So I was going to ask, as people who have interacted a lot with refugees, as people who have given them opportunities, what are some of the biggest things that you believe are incorrect about the narrative, which is usually spread by people and takes hold in people who haven't had that much interaction with refugees? So having interacted with them, what do you think are some of the most important positive things that you took away from them, that you believe other people should know about?
Again, the biggest learning for me is sort of the narrative needs to change around the fact that they're not here by choice. They've been forced to come here, and that's something that really needs to change. And I think that really has happened since, in our model, there's direct interaction with the refugees. So that's where we're slowly changing the narrative. So that we're really breaking that communication barrier that there's been the case. So that's where we're trying to change that impact. But again, different models work differently, but that's how we're trying to make that difference.
And also maybe adding one other thought to this, which is the fact that this is a really valid concern, but it's taken out of context, because resettled refugees are actually more screened than immigrants. So if there is a security concern, it should be with immigrants, to be honest, not with refugees, resettled refugees who are over-screened. I mean, look at me personally, vetting by the UNHCR, vetting by the Canadian Embassy, vetting by the Interpol, vetting by the FBI, vetting by, I counted them, seven different layers of screening that immigrants don't really have to go through. So security is a concern, and always a concern, but it's not with the resettled refugees. What is the number of incidents of violence that happened by a resettled refugee? 0. There's actually more chances for you to get shot by a criminal in America than being a victim of a terrorist incident. And most of the time, well, the terrorist is called the terrorist when he's got a specific affiliation to a specific group, but when it's not, then it's not terrorism. But I'm not going to go there. The thought that I want to end up with is actually I've got this. I'm going to present on this Saturday with TEDx Stanley Park, the biggest TEDx conference in the world. And my intention and my goal is to talk about the global refugee crisis, the fact that it is unavoidable. You know, all we can do right now is try and manage it and try to prevent it from becoming a catastrophe. But most importantly, not look at it as somebody else's problem, because it's at our doorstep. And in this day and age, you're either a refugee like myself or somebody that has to deal with the refugee influx. Having said that, the refugee influx have to be embraced and have to be managed, and maybe try to learn some lessons and treat it as a solution, just like the many ideas that came from our panel today, how refugees can actually fill some gaps in the employment or take jobs that locals don't want, and so on. This is what we need to keep on doing. And so back to my talk and why you brought it up, because I was at a Toastmasters club where somebody came with the same concern about security. And when I shared the fact or what it takes to become a refugee and the different layers of screening, this gentleman have really changed his mind. And he's like, wow, I never thought that refugees have to go through these many levels of screening to get here. And he's like, you're right. We should be more concerned about immigrants then. And I don't know. Thank you so much for your question.
And we just have time for one more with this gentleman here. Yes, sir?
Yeah, so I'm quite interested by the whole, sorry.
Well, we'll...
Yeah, so I was quite interested by the discussion, but I guess, you know, in the context of the UK, for example, so the resettlement, I mean, that would obviously mostly be Syrians that would be resettled. So obviously, therefore, you know, the community sponsorship is more aimed towards that, I would imagine. I don't know about sort of resettlement numbers. But I'm just interested in like an overall sort of picture of how you think community sponsorship could sort of, as a sort of offshoot in some ways, support refugees who could be here or could have been here for a very long time. I mean, I think about what Michelle was saying and what Bekele was saying as well about sort of opening it up and understanding that there are a lot of refugees who have obviously gone through a very long process within the UK and how this could affect them and sort of support or influence that side.
Sure. So you're right. Community sponsorship is a part of the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Scheme. It's a part of the current government's resettlement commitment. But the thing I should stress is you know, there are many ways for communities to get involved in supporting refugees, whether they've come through the spontaneous arrival asylum system, whether they've come through the settlement route. Indeed, many community groups do already. It's just not called community sponsorship. And I guess one of the motivations for the work I'm doing in terms of trying to support the growth of, if you like, the formal community sponsorship is to upskill groups to get engaged in these issues in their communities, to understand the skills required to resettle and support the integration of people into their communities, because it's exactly the same skills are the same people in many cases. You say those that have come through the asylum route rather than resettlement route. So I'd hate to set it up as community sponsorship is some special program that in its own right. It's part of a continuum of things that community groups could get involved in, whether that's you know, those that have gained status through the asylum process, or indeed we see many groups doing amazing work with those that are still in the asylum process, whether they are you know, going through an appeals process or whatever it might be. So you know, community sponsorship in a formal sense, where you're taking responsibility, working with the Home Office and taking a family, you know, directly from a camp, is a big commitment. It's not going to be right for every group, but the skills and the work done, you know, is similar in other ways you can get involved. So we want to encourage groups to get involved in whatever is right for them, whether it's, you know, this program or whether it's another way they can get involved.
And one final question, yes, sir.
Just on the nuts and bolts of the part that most interested in me coming this evening was to try and get more idea on how the Canadian scheme for community sponsorship compares with the British one. And clearly the Canadian one does seem to have been a lot more successful or much easier to run. And I just wonder, I wasn't actually sure from the points I heard earlier, am I right in thinking that the Canadian scheme, a community group, has some input into the refugee who comes, Whereas if I mean, I'm part of a group that's got early stages of organising community sponsorship, and as far as I know, our group won't have any say whatsoever in the person who comes. And there could be a whole range of reasons why you want to do that, whether it's education or age, or whether you want a family with children. But for a British community group to develop the sort of affinity and then the motivation that comes when you do that, the closer you can be to the person who comes, the more likely you're likely to get that sort of stimulus. So
I think I'll bring that question to Michelle, because I think you're well versed to answer that.
Yeah, we do, and I think you already began pointing out all the benefits of being able to do the name yourself, the affinity that you create. It's really important to the motivations of the sponsors who get involved in the sponsorship.
But I guess it's both and, I guess.
Just one thing need to be mentioned, sir. Although you can name a particular person or a particular family, but that alone is not enough. The family that you, or the individual that you are willing to sponsor and bring to Canada need a proof of refugee status, need a proof of refugee recognition. And that's often a document that is issued by either the UNHCR or the government of the country of asylum. And
yeah, I'm aware of that
less than 1% of people do have that. So a lot of people are facing this obstacle where they have somebody in mind, but they cannot really prove their refugee status. So there is a legal limbo in a lot of cases, and only a sponsorship agreement holder like Michelle's can sponsor them. So there is limitations.
The thing I was going to add
it's
is
not that flexible.
There's also there's several different variants of the Canadian scheme. There isn't just one private sponsorship scheme.
Right.
The main one is this: you have this naming ability, and the majority, probably somewhere between 60, 70, even 80%. I haven't got the latest statistics of those sponsored go through that named kind of route. There is also a blended scheme, which is very, very similar to our UK scheme. And in fact, in the last 12 months, through that blended scheme, where those coming forward to sponsor, just like the UK, essentially get allocated to refugee, like the UNHCR scheme. They've done thousands, not tens or hundreds, in the last 12 months in Canada through that scheme alone. There are some read across from the Canadian example to the UK scheme. This point about naming, it looks unlikely to be on the policy agenda in the short term with the Home Office here. But I guess I'd say it's worked successfully without naming in Canada as well as those that have been named. So.
Could I just add one very quick inference from that, which it would seem to me that it would be far more likely that the Home Office's community sponsorship scheme, as opposed to the BKS, the local authority, the community sponsorship scheme would work far more effectively if pressure were put on the Home Office to allow people to be able to have some input in it. And if that's the case, I think all the groups that are here that we've heard from, if you agree with that, would be well advised to do that, or I would urge or encourage them to do so.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we have to leave it there. This is a conversation that could go on for many more hours. I'd like to thank my panel, Pranav Chopra, Chris Clements and Mohammad Al Saleh. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I hope you found this evening informative, and it's filled in some of the gaps that you may have had about community sponsorship, the education pathways and the business pathways. You can keep up to date on our website, on the IOHR TV. Also following our social media feeds, we will be following this story closely. Thank you, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.